Okay, so a few things I wanted to talk about. Bit of background. I was a 11-year-old geeky kid in the summer of '69. So I had the newspapers and the Life magazines and the models, and Apollo 11 just totally changed my life. And so it's been something that I've been following 50 years. And over time, things have been made available, information, especially through the internet, that you know, if you're really interested, you can understand what happened during that mission, you know, in detail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what changes they made to the LEM on the launch pad, which is kind of fascinating, and some aspects about the landing and the moonwalk. A big question that we all have, and we may want to learn today, is why Neil was chosen to be the first man to step on the lunar surface. Our speaker tonight, Professor Hansen, will deal with that, and so I'm going to leave that tough one to him. I do want to talk about someone who I personally got to know quite well, Owen Maynard. Our president, Chris Gaynor, came to an international space development conference that we held in 1994 in Toronto. That's when I first met him, but also at that conference, several people from the Canadian Space Society invited all of as many as they could, Canadians who had been working on the Avro Arrow, and when it was canceled in 1959, Bob Gilruth from Manned Space in Langley came up to Toronto and essentially interviewed a whole bunch of them and hired 30 of them to come down to NASA to work on the early Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program. Owen was one of those people. He grew up in Sarnia, flew mosquitoes during the war, but actually became essentially the engineer for Apollo during the Apollo, at least the Apollo missions, and was one of two people you can consider to be the father of the LEM. He was the father of the LEM on the NASA side, and then a fellow named Tom Kelly who was with Grumman, was the father of the LEM on that side. And I was very, about 20 years ago, before Owen passed away in 2000, before Tom Kelly passed away, with Dave Levy's help, I was able to get asteroids named after both Owen and Tom Kelly. So part of the, you know, part of getting to know Owen through the Canadian Space Society and the RASC, some people made it possible to have the engineering department of the U of T give Owen an honorable diploma. And Chris, do you remember what year that was? 95? 96, okay, the summer of 96. And of course, here is Chris Gaynor photobombing the picture of Owen and Owen's son Ross, and that's Jim Floyd on the right, who was the designer of the Avro Arrow, right? Yeah. Still alive at 104 or something? Yeah. So what did Owen do? One of the things he did is he was involved with planning the missions. How do you get to the moon? How many missions do you actually need to fly? And so he gave them simple letters, A through G. And the first two, the A and B had to do with flying the spacecraft unmanned. And then you had the first manned mission, a manned mission with the command module and the lunar module in low Earth orbit, a manned mission with the same spacecraft, same two types of spacecraft in a higher orbit, 6,500 kilometers, and then actually send the command module, command service module, lunar module to the moon, and then land. So that's 5 manned missions. I think that is extremely optimistic, and would have been extremely optimistic back in 1968. But what Owen did is through each mission, he set certain plateaus. And essentially at each of these plateaus, there would be a go, no-go decision. You know, do we continue, or do we know how to get the crew back safely? So I think if you sat around the table in the 60s and started talking about how many missions it would take to land on the moon, probably they thought it would be more than 5. So in other words, if you fly an E or F mission and it doesn't accomplish all the objectives, then you decide, do we need to refly the mission, or can we move some of those objectives to a future mission? So this is what really happened, and it more or less went this way, except Apollo 8, which was planned to fly a LEM in low Earth orbit, the LEM wasn't ready, so they decided to send Apollo 8 to the moon instead. But that's the only difference. So Apollo 7 was the first mission, flew the command service module in Earth orbit for 11 days, so that's like longer than what they planned for a full lunar mission. So that certified that spacecraft. As I mentioned, Apollo 8 went to the moon. Apollo 9, which was the original D mission, was the low Earth orbit with the moon, the lunar module, and you can see they filled the D with a little red bit there because it was the D mission. So fortunately, one of the astronauts had a D in his last name. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal for the mission, and it's interesting. Owen said that he had a meeting in his living room with the Apollo 10 crew early in the planning because there was some thought that, well, maybe we can skip the lunar orbit aspect of it. The LEM that they had for that mission would not have been able to land on the moon. Not that there wasn't enough fuel or anything, it was just too heavy. But you know, he and some of the management actually talked to them about delaying a few months and flying Apollo 10 as the first landing attempt. And Tom Stafford, the commander, vetoed that. He said, no, we have to get a command module, a lunar module, into lunar orbit. We have to do all the navigation, communication. We have to get the LEM right to 50,000 feet, 250 miles east of the landing site where you'd start your engine for the descent. Let's get to that point so that the next crew that actually has to land can just do everything we've done. Plus, if they'd stuck a landing onto their workload, then they would have had to learn how to land, they would learn how to do the moonwalk and everything. And so I think, you know, a lot can be, we owe a lot, I think, to Tom Stafford and his crew for what they did during that mission to prepare for Apollo 11. These flights were flying every 2 months. I still can't believe it. Between October 68, when the first Apollo flew, and July 69, that's just 9 months, 10 months. It was just, the pace was unbelievable. It was so fast that during Apollo 10, Apollo 11 was moved to the pad, mid-May in 69. And that's, you know, that was to just keep the pace up. The idea was if Apollo 11 tries in July and fails, then they had 2 more chances that year because everything was based on the Kennedy pledge or objective to land by the end of 69. And everyone was working towards that. So here's Apollo 10 being prepared in the operations and checkout building at Kennedy Space Center. You can see all the different types of colored Kapton and painted material. That's all just for thermal protection. The LEM was essentially like a thermos bottle. Essentially, all the liquids inside had to be kept at room temperature. So all the colors and the materials on the outside of the LEM are made just to keep the LEM inside at room temperature. There weren't many good pictures of the lunar module during the flight with the descent stage, but this is the lunar module. They called this one Snoopy, and you can see, you can see the reaction control engines here. There's 16 of them. There's 4 quads of 4. And 4 of them are pointing straight down. And they found, after looking at photographs and also reports from the crew after the mission, that the exhaust from these reaction control engines were impinging on the top of the descent stage and really wrecking the thermal protection on the descent stage. And if they had landed with that damage, there was some concern. So on the pad, they decided they needed to do something about that for the LEM 5 for Apollo 11, which was called Eagle. So when you load a lunar module onto, they load it on a big stack and move it out to the vehicle assembly building to be put on top of the Saturn V. You'll notice that this is what's called the SLA, the SLA, or the Spacecraft Launch Adapter. And you notice there's a little door here. And it lines up nicely with the front hatch of the LEM because you've got to get in there when it's on the pad just to load it with spacesuits and film and all that other stuff. And so that's what the lunar module looks like. And in fact, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on each LEM as it sits on the pad. You can see the reaction control engines still have protected covers on them. So when the Saturn V is rolled out to the pad, there's this MLS, oh gosh, I don't even remember that one, mobile launch structure, which moves up against the rocket for the 3 months that it's on the pad. And all of this structure here encases the spacecraft area, and that's where they can get access to the spacecraft to prepare it for launch. So inside the slaw, they set up scaffolding. And they'd go through that little door, and they'd set up all of this scaffolding to give them access to aspects of the ascent stage and descent stage of the lunar module. And of course, they'd have to fill it with fuel at a certain point in time, and there was liquid helium in one of the tanks, and you load cameras and film and all these other things. Well, one of the things they did is they created and attached 4 coal chutes. This is what they called the coal chutes, which essentially were these deflectors which deflected the exhaust from the downward reaction control system. And this is nickel foil, which could sustain high temperatures. And essentially that just deflected the exhaust away from the descent stage. There are other things that they did too. This is a cool picture. This is 2 technicians attaching a plaque to a later lunar module. I don't think it was the one when they switched out the Apollo 13 astronaut. I think they actually carried that with them, that they were going to change it on the moon's surface. But you can see that it's very tight. But also, if you look down from where you are right now, if you're one of these guys, you see the top of a fuel tank on the Saturn third stage. So that's why everything, like watches and glasses and everything, is tethered off, so that you don't drop it. One drop and the mission is delayed months and months. Also, there was a progression of what people learned. The Grumman lunar module thermal people, after each mission, learned, based on data and photographs, what to use for various types of thermal foil and different materials for covering to essentially do a better job of protecting the lunar module thermally. And this is a diagram that my friend Paul Fjeld made. And if you look through all of the different lunar modules, descent stage, ascent stage, they're essentially all different until the last couple missions. So it was a learning process through the entire Apollo program. What they did to figure out the thermal aspects of flight is they had this tunnel in Bethpage in Long Island, which they could turn into a vacuum, and then they could fire these shots of flame to simulate the aspects of the thruster fire on the spacecraft, but also simulate the effect of the sun. And this is a close-up of LEM 9, which was one that did not fly. It's on display at the Kennedy Space Center. So you can see a coal chute here. Notice in NASA, every part has to have a serial number. And that's exactly what that is. So there's the porch to the lunar module. Various types of kapton. The darker kaptons mean they're thicker. But you'll notice there's a lot of this nickel foil just to protect the external parts of the LEM from exhaust and from the sun. So the walkout on July 16th, 1969 was early morning. Must have been crazy. But essentially, each astronaut through Apollo and all of the shuttle missions walked down this gangway and into the vehicle. Since the flight was 9:30, this would have been like at 6 in the morning. And you can imagine how many reporters there were. One interesting thing that Mike Collins said in his book was that he was carrying a grocery bag. And I don't think you can see it in that previous photo. You might be able to see it in the previous photo because it's in his right hand. But he's got this, these gloves. They're all breathing pure oxygen, so they have to have their helmets on, they have to have their gloves on, whatever. So he was scared to death that he'd be walking out during this historic moment and drop the grocery bag, because what it was a gift for Gunther Wendt, who he was one of the Germans from Huntsville, and they called him the Pad Führer, because he had been involved with putting astronauts into the, on the launch pad, handling everything that went through the White Room. And you can go back to Mercury and see Gunther Wendt helping astronauts into the spacecraft. And he was the Pad Führer, and he was actually not involved for Apollo 1, and after the fire, they brought him back and made him in charge of all activity in the White Room. So every astronaut crew would bring Gunther a present. And what was in Michael Collins' bag, since Gunther was a fisherman, was a trophy trout. So you can imagine what the historians would write if during the first historic walk of Apollo 11 out to be taken to the launch pad, if Gunther's trophy trout had fallen out in front of the photographers. So the launch took place on July 16th, and a few days later was the landing. The landing is essentially all braking, all slowing down. You're going a certain velocity in lunar orbit, just like when you're in Earth orbit, if you slow down, you fall. And if you keep slowing down, you'll fall further and further. The astronauts in the lunar module don't have to worry about re-entering because there's no atmosphere. But essentially, the process is to start at 50,000 feet, 250 nautical miles east of your landing site. And most of the time, your engine is just pointing in the direction you're going. So the astronauts, unless they roll their windows down, they can't see where they're going. So either roll the windows down and see the moon passing behind them, or look up into the blackness of space. And then at a certain point, when you get to a certain altitude, they begin to pitch over, and actually the astronauts can look out the windows and get their first view. And that's why the lunar module windows are sort of canted forward, so that the astronauts can sort of peek, get on their tippy toes and get a better view as they tilt over. Then during the final few minutes during the landing phase, it's usually the astronaut takes over manually and flies it in. So this whole process takes about 12 minutes. So on the bottom of the probes of the lunar module are these probes sticking out. And this is the Apollo 9 LEM 3, and you see there are 4 probes there. These are meant such that when you land, and they're 6-foot probes, they didn't want the astronauts to land with the engine firing. They were concerned that if the engine's still firing when it's on the surface, it would kick rocks up into the engine and cause an explosion. So the idea was, when any of these probes hit the lunar surface, a little light about the size of a toonie or a $50 or whatever, this little blue light would come on, and you'd turn off the engine. This is actually a picture I took inside LEM 9, which is down at the Kennedy Space Center. So that's an actual lunar module there. For Apollo 11, they took off the probe on the landing gear with the ladder, because there was concern that, and this is a painting that my friend Paul Fjeld made, you can see as the first probe that did hit was this one. And in fact, when you see further pictures, you can actually figure out the direction of the LEM, how it was moving based on which way the probe bent. And here are some probes there. You can see some of them are tilted up. So having a probe on the pad with the ladder would have been a bad idea, because it could have been one small step for as the astronaut would trip over the probe. So the moonwalk was supposed to start at 3 in the morning. Armstrong and Aldrin there was a sleep period set up, but Armstrong decided that he'd have probably a better audience if they did a little earlier. Or, the thing is, if you're on the moon and you wait 8 hours to walk, something can go wrong, and Houston will say, get off the moon. So once you're on the moon, get out as soon as you can. So his first step was actually not here, and a lot of videos show them saying the first step is when he's actually jumping off of the ladder. And the reason the ladder doesn't go all the way down to the foot pad is because that 36 inches was crushable honeycomb to be able to survive a 10 foot per second landing. And of course, the astronauts just greased every landing, so there was very little compression. So they always had to jump down off of the ladder. This is a test mock-up in Grumman where they actually tested dropping LEMs. They dropped LEMs thousands of times to test the dynamics. So he's actually jumping off the LEM. Then what he had to do, like this model here, is he would have had to put his right foot on the side of the foot pad and with his left foot squish it into the ground and say his first words. There was, at one point, plans not to take TV to the moon. It wasn't considered to be, the camera, it has weight, it has complexity. And this was a black and white camera that was in the Mesa, which is a sort of a storage equipment bay that's folded up against the lunar module. And when Armstrong came out onto the porch, there was a little D-ring that he pulled. This thing folded down, and there you can see him practicing at a Mesa. That's where they had tools, they had rock storage containers. And the camera, which was stored upside down, showed the image upside down. And someone was supposed to flip it, but they forgot to flip it. So the first pictures from the moon were upside down. But it was a black and white camera. It didn't send back normal framing rate, didn't do the regular number that we are used to. That was picked up in Australia, and it had to be converted real time to North American standard and then sent by satellite. And there was a big issue recently because they actually videotaped the video that they were getting, and it was much clearer than what we got once it was sent by satellite. And there was a big, I think it was about 10 years ago or whatever, they were looking for these tapes, but they'd all been scratched. So all we have are these stills that the people in Australia, where they received the signal, took off their TV. So it was much clearer, and unfortunately we don't have that. Lunar surface pictures. They had one camera, and Aldrin and Armstrong traded back and forth the camera. But they also had a 16 millimeter camera in the window where they captured the view out the window during landing, but also during the moonwalk they took a 1 frame per second of the activity on the surface. So that's from the 1 frame per second. This is when Armstrong was taking the emergency, when he got on the moon, the first thing that he had to do was pick up a rock and put it in your pocket, just in case Houston said, the LEM's in big trouble, you got to get back in and get off the surface. And so they actually began to nag him because he was taking pictures and looking around. And they said, have you got the contingency sample yet? But there you can see his faceplate, his gold visor is up, and you can see Armstrong's face. And that, unfortunately, is the best picture that we have of Armstrong on the surface. He got down on the surface, and then using a clothesline device, Aldrin sent the camera down, and he started taking pictures. This is the first picture that was taken, and of course it shows the first garbage bag on the moon, because that's what they did. They just kicked out the garbage from inside. This is what they just could have landed in, because this was just right in front of the lunar module. And he took some pictures. Then he took pictures of Aldrin coming out. And then setting up a solar wind experiment. And then saluting the flag. And that's really all we've got. We don't have anything of Armstrong. And what kills me is during this time, if you and I were on the moon and I was by the flag and you had the camera and you took a picture of me, I'd probably say, hey, yeah, give me the camera, I'll take a picture of you. But it wasn't in the plan. So they didn't do it. Maybe Jim will have something to say about that tonight. But at one point, Aldrin took the camera and did a pan. So he stood in the shadow of the LEM and just did a 360 taking pictures. And if you take a 360, you're going to get Armstrong at some time. And that's him working at the Mesa. So there's that famous picture. I guess he is reflected in the visor. Aldrin took pictures of various aspects of the LEM just to look for damage. And he took a picture of the solar wind, and Armstrong just photobombed it. But that's Armstrong. You can see it. You actually, on a good quality picture, you can read, they put their names on their backpacks so they wouldn't mix them up. A nice view of the landing gear. This is a kind of a neat picture because it shows the Earth. It shows the communications antenna and the coal chutes. Just a little bit about the flag. That's where it was stored, on the side of the ladder. It didn't wave in the vacuum. They knew it was a vacuum. So they stuck a steel rod along the top to hold it up. So that looks like, you know, it's nice presentation. What happens when it breaks? On Apollo 12, it didn't work. So that's what they had on Apollo 12. So I want to finish with just some of the problems that they had on the landing. You simulate and you plan, but you never really know what's going to happen until you try something. So there were 5 things problems that they had. One was bad communications. Their communications antenna was here, and once they're on their back flying, the structure of the LEM blocked the signal from the communications antenna. So Mission Control just had them do a little yaw. It would have been a yaw. No, it would have been a roll. Just a little roll so that the communications antenna could see Earth, and that fixed that problem. They, for some reason, which we know now, but they were way downrange, about 3 miles downrange. And Armstrong was ingenious in many. He's very innovative. He knew that this grid on the window could be used to time when a certain crater went by, and this crater went by early in the descent, about 3 seconds early. So he called down that we were going to be a little long before anyone else, or I don't know if Mission Control wouldn't have known that by then. So the concern there, of course, is here's the landing area. This is the prime landing area. This is where they ended up landing, which is just around a very cratery area. But that wasn't a big problem, but it certainly was a problem because they didn't know where they landed, and they wanted to know exactly where they landed. The big problem was the computer alarms. And essentially what happened was this is the rendezvous antenna that they use when they're going back up into orbit and they're trying to find the command module. So that's only when they use it. They don't use it when they're landing. But there was a switch set in a position which followed their checklist that actually had that thing sending information to the computer. And there wasn't a lot of memory in the computer, and so the computer was calling out with these 1201, 1202s, I'm doing too much. I have to reboot. Fortunately, it only takes half a second for a LEM computer to reboot, not like if you got a blue screen with Windows 95 or something like that, right? But during this whole time, this is a painting that was used on a book called Digital Apollo. Here's the DISCI, or displaying keyboard, showing a 1202. This is Armstrong's perspective. Aldrin's calling this information out because he's looking out the window, but what he said was his attention was directed to the alarms, and he wasn't watching out the window. And then he looks out the window, and here he is heading for West Crater, which we said was about the size of the Houston Astrodome, with automobile-sized blocks on the side. So he took over control, and essentially at about a couple hundred feet was flying 95 miles an hour, hovering across the lunar surface. Mission Control saw that in their telemetry, but he wasn't telling them what he was doing. He was actually telling them, but his microphone was set on push to talk. So for us to hear him, he would have had to push a button. It was all recorded, and you could hear it afterwards. But Mission Control didn't know what he was doing, but they knew that he was flying like crazy across the lunar surface to find a flat spot. Now the big problem was fuel. Here he was taking over. He was flying a little bit farther downrange. And then there was a signal that they were 1 minute away from running out of fuel. This is one of the fuel tanks, and there's a low-level sensor in this. I guess just like I don't know how a gasoline tank in a car works, but maybe it has something like that. But in zero gravity, you have to have pressurize the tank with nitrogen or something such that it pushes the fuel down to the bottom. And they felt that once it gets down to a certain point, they knew what the level of the fuel was, and then they could start this countdown. So it was a 60-second countdown down to what they called bingo, which was another 20 seconds. And so at some point when you're listening to the landing, you hear them say 60 seconds, and they're still coming in. They're still like 100 feet up, and everyone's getting all excited. This is a view through the 16-millimeter data acquisition camera that I showed you looking out the window. And you can see the attitude that the LEM is in. He's not horizontal. He's beginning to pitch over. But watch the horizon. That was not supposed to happen. That was caused by fuel slosh. Because more than half of the weight of the LEM was fuel. And so at this point, when the fuel got down to a certain point, it was sloshing around. So essentially what happened was one of the low-level sensors was uncovered early. And even though you may read that they only had 15 seconds of fuel left, estimates are they had between 30 and 45 seconds of fuel before the 20-second countdown. But they didn't know that at the time. To fix that in future LEMs, I don't think 12 got it, they put in special baffles to control that. So that's a lot, but that's my talk, and the rest is history. Thank you. I guess we have a minute or two for questions, and Ron, if you want to come up here and get ready.
Hi, Randy.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you tell us something about this computer geek, Guido, who actually allowed this landing to take place? Because it came very close. These alarms that they had.
Yeah, I'll set that up for you.
And he overrode the.
Yeah, the 1201, 1202 were actually, if you're a computer program, where you put in debugging code. That's what they were. They weren't proper alarms. And in fact, not all of the mission control people knew what was going on. So there's mission control, then there's something called SPAN, Spacecraft Analysis Room, where there's backup people. No, SPAN is more industry or whatever, but you see mission control, and each one of the guys, the flight controllers, has a team in another room. So the flight controller handles something right away. The guys in the other room handle something in a few minutes, and then there's another room full of industry and whatever where they solve things over hours and hours. Anyway, one of the guys in the back room knew about the code because they'd had a special test a few weeks before, and they'd actually seen it and they'd explain it, and he had a little cue card. And basically it was 1201, 1202 is executive overflow. As long as it doesn't keep happening, you're fine. And that's what he called to Steve Bayless, who was on the console. And Steve Bayless is the guy. And these guys were like 26, 27 years old. So he called the flight and said, we're go flight, as long as it doesn't keep happening, we're go. So it happened several times, but because they had time for it to reboot and take more data, they survived. Okay, thanks very much.